What's up guys, Dan Forlani here and welcome back to a new video. If you're new to this channel, there's one thing you need to know. I make videos, vlogs, tutorials, reviews on the Canon M50, the Canon 90D and the Canon EOS R. If you subscribe, don't forget to activate the notification bell. That way you won't miss any of my future videos. Now, what do I talk about today? I want to talk about frame rates. What about them? When we shoot a video, we need to know that there is a standard. If you want your video, your film, to look cinematic, it has to be shot at 24 frames per second with the shutter speed of double the frame rate. So 1/48th, we don't have 1/48th of a second, so we set it to 1/50th of a second. And that way, we make sure we get the most cinematic blur in the movement and cinematic overall look. However, why 24? Well, it's actually 23.976. That's because immediately after silent movies, which were shot between 15 and 17 frames per second, which is the minimum amount of frames per second that our eyes can perceive as a movement, they switched to 24 to be able to sync the video with the audio. And we got used to that 24. It became a standard in the cinema industry. So whenever we see a frame rate different from 24 frames per second, we perceive it as strange, not natural. We need to be aware that we can shoot also in 30 frames per second. Many TV shows, sitcoms, the news are usually shot in 30 frames per second. It's supposed to give a tiny little touch of reality in the footage. But the difference is not huge. Well, there are also different frame rates, like higher frame rates like 60, 120, which we use usually for slow motion. Because if we shoot in a frame rate higher than 30 frames per second in real time, it doesn't usually look cinematic. I can make you this example, like there is a movie, The Hobbit, which was shot in 50 frames per second. And the first reaction of the people, of the viewers watching The Hobbit was like they were feeling kind of uncomfortable. When you watch a video or a movie at a higher frame rate and played in real time, it's not about the motion blur, it's about the overall image, the feeling we get. It's kind of like if we were watching theater rather than a movie. My advice, you can shoot and edit in 24 and 30 frames per second. But if you shoot in 60 or 50 or whatever, I suggest you use that only for slow motion, like to slow it down in post. But again, your taste, your decision. Can we mix the frame rates? It depends. If we edit on a 24 frames per second timeline, yeah, sure. You can use 30 frames per second clips. Since the timeline will have only 24 frames in every second, it will drop the extra 6 frames from the 30 frames per second clip. Usually you won't even notice the difference, but can we do the opposite? Well, if we shoot in 24 frames per second and we put the footage on a 30 frames per second timeline, well, the 24 frames per second footage would not have enough frames to be played smoothly on a 30 frames per second timeline. Some of the frames would be duplicated, and that's not a good thing. So the best option is to shoot and edit everything at the same frame rate. Like you shoot at 24 frames per second, you edit on a 24 frames per second timeline. You shoot in 30 frames per second, you edit on a 30 frames per second timeline. Or, as I said earlier, on a 24 frames per second timeline, you can add some 30 frames per second footage, or in the case of 60 or 120, you can do that as long as you slow them down for slow motion. Just hit the like button, subscribe if you ain't already, and check the links in the description to see all my gear stuff and things, my gear. And check the link to Epidemic Sound if you want 1 month of awesome music and great sound effects to use in your video for 1 month for free. Alright, now I'm gonna show you some samples from my Canon M50, Canon 90D, and Canon EOS R in 24 and 30 frames per second. Just to give you the idea of the look, because this is a 24 frames per second timeline, and you can't really appreciate the difference of 24 versus 30 frames per second, but you get the idea of a different look. If you want to see what these clips in 30 frames per second look like on a 30 frames per second timeline, I made another video which is unlisted. It's just for you. I put the link down here in the description, and you can play it and see what 30 frames per second actually looks like on a 30 frames per second timeline. So here in this video, you can see the general look, which one you might like more, which one you might prefer, and you see it on a 24 frames per second timeline. There you can see what they look like, 100% 30 frames per second. But let's watch. Alright, so what do you think about it? Leave a comment down below, hit the like button and subscribe if you ain't already. Check the links in the description to see all my gear stuff and things. Alright, so we have seen that it's totally possible to use some 30 frames per second footage on a 24 frames per second timeline. And we saw 24 and we saw 30. Which one do you prefer? And let me know, what frame rate do you usually shoot? Personally, for my own videos, I do 24. I prefer the look of 24 rather than 30. For some of my works, I'm obliged to use 30. It depends on the client. That's it for today. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash the like button, subscribe if you ain't already, and I'll see you guys in the next video.